can we please give a huge round of applause and cheer for Lynne Murphy, who's going to tell us about how America.
So I feel like I need to apologize, and not just for being an American who speaks your language, but because I have been giving this talk since 2011. And I have given it twice in Hastings, once in St. Leonard's, twice in Eastbourne. I can't believe there's anyone who hasn't heard it already. But I've met one person so far this evening who hasn't. So, yes. This talk became, this 15-minute talk became this book. And it started out with me noticing, so I'm a professor of linguistics. I moved to this country in 2000 from the United States. And I started to notice how my language, my mother's language, my grandmother's language, was being talked about in the British press. So here we've got British children turn to American English as if you would turn to a life of prostitution and drugs. Right? BBC criticized for creeping Americanisms. Time for Americanisms to take a rain check. Don't talk garbage. American words are mangling our English. Got quite a few metaphors going on here. Americanisms, 50 of your most noted examples. So when this was on the BBC website, it was cited all over the world in other news sites where they tended to misremember the headline as 50 of your most hated examples. And it was no wonder, considering the content of the article. Matthew Engel wrote a whole book about the American conquest of English, because of all those people in the Pentagon trying to get you to verb your nouns. And the Independent, led with 41 things the Americans say wrong. So this is what I have had to face as a foreigner in this country. And this is what I think of as anti-Americanism, right? A prejudice against American words. And the thing about a prejudice is if you scratch a prejudice, you can usually find a fear, right? And that fear I like to call ameralexicophobia, fear of American words. But the thing is, it's gone beyond phobia. It's gone beyond fear. It's become completely insane. It's there goes my big reveal. Right, pretend that didn't happen. So ameralexicophobia, and if you have a fear and it goes untreated for too long, you can end up with a real problem, which I call ameralexicosis. It is the complete fabrication, the complete hallucination of American English coming to get you. A certain paranoia. I have a 45-minute version of this talk where I give you lots of examples. I'm going to give you one example here. Whoop, and I've just gone in the wrong direction again. So now you've seen that? That result. So anyway, so this is an article from the Telegraph where the headline is BBC criticized for creeping Americanisms, and this is about Americanisms that people are hearing on the radio, and as you've just sort of guessed from having seen the coming slide, almost half of them are not Americanisms. Okay, so they're just presented in a newspaper, not fact-checked, just presented in a newspaper as if they are. So you got fess up instead of confess, all right, July 5th instead of July the 5th, take a look instead of have a look, ahead of instead of before, but then we get to face up instead of confront, which the Oxford English Dictionary tells us they can first find it in the works of Daniel Defoe, famously not an American from a long time ago. It's a big ask. Do you know where that's from? Australia. All right. I first learned it when I moved here. and I assumed it was British until I looked it up, which was more than the Telegraph could do. So, and then the last one there is, it might have been instead of it might have been. And this one puzzled me because that's really kind of a spelling error, right? Because if you spelled it as apostrophe V-E, that's basically how might have is pronounced. How they heard the spelling error on the radio, I haven't quite figured out. But in any case, it is not an Americanism. It is a spelling error. And on that point, I want to point out that Americans are no worse at English than British people are. And that kind of helps me tell. This has gone funny in its colors. But anyway, this is a chart of something. The linguists use tools called corpora. They're big electronic collections of text. This is a big electronic collection of web-based English. And here I have looked for instances of could've, would've, and should've. And who spells it with OF? Well, the highest bar there in that bar chart is the UK. Right? We can look at it in a different way. Here's, on the top is the incorrect spelling. The darker the blue, the greater, the more associated with that country it is. So we've got the very dark blue for British for the misspelling. With the correct spelling, we've got the very dark blue for the Americans. So Americans are not necessarily any worse at English than anybody else. Everybody's got their faults, but this isn't one of ours. And so my first sort of moral of the evening is disliking. All right. So there was another slide. That disliking a bit of English is not enough to make it American. And so what I want to talk about a little bit here is how we might be able to appreciate American English. I am not saying that American English is better than anybody else's English. I think everybody's English is wonderful. But when we want to think about who's preserving the language, who's saving the language, we might want to look westward. That is, not towards St. Leonard's. So Americans have saved the English language, number one, by not changing things. So many of the things that I hear complained about as being Americanisms, why did the Americans do this to the language, were not things that anybody did. They're things that people did not do. So here's David Mitchell looking a very much younger man. And he did a series of podcasts for The Guardian. And in this video podcast, and in this particular one, he's bearing a message from the Queen to Americans, where he says, the Queen says she's okay with all these silly things you do with English. You know, she's amused that you took the U out of color and whatever. But there are a few things that she cannot abide. And one of them, he says, it's the tidbit, which you change from titbit because you think the syllable tit is intrinsically rude. Okay? And I have to say, Mitchell went to Cambridge, which is why I think he's allergic to the Oxford English Dictionary, because all you need to do is look it up, and it will tell you right there that it comes from tidbit, where tit meant something precious. And it's a word that's been lost in English. But that's where tidbit comes from. A tidbit was a precious little thing. Over the years, as people stopped calling things tit so much, people misheard it as a tit, right? Now, tit means a little thing, so various birds with tit in the fronts of their names, like titmus and titlark and things like that. So this has gone from a word that means precious little thing to a word that means little thing, essentially. But what you can see here is that this is not the only case. That in British English, there's a general tendency to take other words and make them into tit. And I have to say, when I moved here, I was quite shocked by page 3, but then it all made sense. Okay, another one that Mitchell talked about was herb. So you're French now with your herbal teas and your herbal remedies. But once again, the H in herb is one that, or the H-lessness of herb, is something that Americans saved from Older English. Again, we can look in the Oxford English Dictionary, which keeps a historical record, and we can see that, or I can see, maybe it's too small for you to see, but in Middle English this had no H on it. It was herb. Then the monks who were transcribing things, they knew Latin. And they knew that Latin had an H in this word. So they started writing an H to make it look fancy. But nobody pronounced that H for another 400 years. Until, and we're going to meet them again later this evening, the Victorians, who, at that point, H became a class signifier in England. You know, so if you dropped your H's, if you said house instead of house, it suddenly was a sign of being lower class. And so hoity-toity people started putting H's where they hadn't been before. And herb was a victim of that. Okay? So Americans aren't trying to be French when they say herb, they're trying to be English. Okay, Americans also saved a lot of other things there. So if you look at any difference between American and British English that's more than 150 years old, it's probably something that Americans just hung on to, which had come over from Britain. So things like that we say are R's in all their places, you know, that came over with the English immigrants at the time, because when America was being settled by English people, people weren't dropping their R's yet. People were saying farmer. They sounded like pirates, right? They weren't dropping their syllables in words like secretary instead of secretary, right? So those sorts of things have hung on in America. Grammatical forms, the manative subjunctive form is one that at the turn of the century, linguists were saying had completely died out in England. So saying, I suggested that he write to you, instead of he writes to you. Now, British people got away with not saying, I suggested that he write to you, because they started saying should in that position. I suggested that he should write to you. But Americans kept the subjunctive form, and it had a resurgence in America in the 19th century, and now in the 21st century in Britain, it has got a foothold back here. So, yes, America is having an influence on British English, but sometimes it's because, like the beavers, right? We've taken an endangered species, we've helped it along elsewhere, and then we've reintroduced it into the wild. That's what happens to the subjunctive. Gotten, another thing which came over with, you know, it's an old English thing which came over went over to America and then has come back. You hear young people saying gotten a lot now. That is just something that came from traditional Old English. Okay, lots of words that Americans say are words that used to be said in England. I was going to say in Brighton, more than just in Brighton. So for instance, transportation. So Americans don't say transport except as a verb. So we wouldn't talk about London transport, municipal transport, we talk about municipal transportation. The reason why the British no longer do is because of penal transportation to Australia. So this word got such a bad reputation that we needed a new word, transport, to put in its place, to talk about nice things like buses and subways, tube trains. Okay, fall, the season, closet rather than the cupboard, sidewalk, all things that originated in the UK. Okay, and then there are also a lot of words that we've got that have acquired different meanings or that have different meanings now than in the two countries. And a lot of the meanings that are still in America are meanings that were lost in Britain rather than meanings that Americans made up. So mad meaning angry, smart meaning clever, regular meaning ordinary. Those are all things that have been brought from England to America and thrived there while being forgotten here. Okay, so that's one way that America can be said to have saved English. Another way is that sometimes when Americans have made changes to English, it was in the interest of being truer to English. So, and sometimes they weren't exactly changes. If we take, for example, something like the pronunciation schedule rather than schedule. All right, how did we get different pronunciations of that? Well, back in the day when English people were going over to these new colonies, people said sedule. There was no CH in it. So the word was sedule for a long time. And then the French put a CH in it. And the British were all like, well, they've got a CH. We better have a CH too. They might get ahead of us in letters. So they added the CH, and then nobody knew how to pronounce it. So there were all these debates in the late 18th century about how to pronounce these words, which were going on in pronouncing dictionaries back and forth. And there was the argument that it should be a sh, based on that's what the French are doing, right? It came from French, and that's what the French are doing. But the other argument was that it should be ska, because in English, in words like school or scheme, we pronounce the SCH as ska. So you can see that as sort of being the Anglophiles, the people going after an English pronunciation, versus the people going after a French pronunciation, and that ended up dividing on national lines. And I think this is a general trend we can see in British English, that because of the influence of the Normans, and the Normans being, you know, the aristocracy for so long, people were looking over to France for linguistic style. But of course, English is a Germanic language, which is just borrowed in these words from French. And so it acts a little bit differently. The U's in words like honor, or labor, or color are another way that I would say the removal of those U's is not necessarily any sort of harm to English. So these U's are there because the French had them. So in Anglo-Norman, the kind of French that was spoken in England back when the Normans came over, they were pronouncing it honor, right? It wasn't sound. And the spelling went through many changes. In Shakespeare, in his first folio, it's spelt without an O more than it's spelt with an O. I mean, U. It's spelt without a U more than it's spelt with a U. So this isn't a spelling that Americans made up. It was just one that they chose out of the spellings that were available. And one could say that it is the more English spelling in various ways, in that when we pronounce these words, we don't say oo. When we look back further in the etymology to Latin, there is no U. So French had the U, but the earlier language, Latin, did not. And by adding the U, English created a difficult situation, because you have to remember, okay, you've got a U in honor, and you've got a U in honorable, but let's not have a U in honorific, or honorary, right? So, in essence, we've kept, you know, not having the U there uncomplicates English, makes it more English and less French. I thought I had another slide there. Aubergine versus eggplant, another example. All right, so, and then the third way that we might think of America as saving the English language is that it would not be the global language it is today without a very powerful economic force behind it. And so this is in the point that was made by Michael Skopinker. I'm never quite sure which syllable, the accent on that word goes, but anyway, him writing in the Financial Times was making that point here, that something weird's happened to my slides. You can't see the earth anymore. So all the colors have gone a bit weird here. So these are countries where English, I hope you can tell that's America and Canada in the green on the one side, that's parts of Africa. So these are the countries in which English is an official or default official language. The Scandinavian countries are sort of counted there because they've got near 90% literacy in English. So even if it's not an official language, it might as well be. So large parts of the world do have English as an official language, and that is mostly because of British imperialism, right? So the British went, they set up boundaries on countries, and when they left, those countries had a bureaucracy based in English, and they took on English as an official language. But if we look at who's speaking English now, it's gone much, much further than that. And it's not just about who used to be colonized by English speakers. It's now about more economic movements. And I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I am saying that it does make English a very powerful language in the world, and that is not without the backing of a very large economy. Okay, so looking at those maps, such as they were, we can see American English is in no, or not American English, the English language is in no danger. It's being spoken all over the world by lots of people. When you've got something that's spoken in a lot of places by a lot of people, it changes, right? It evolves. It becomes more useful to more people. And we expect that to happen. That means we've got a thriving, healthy language, despite the fact that the BBC keeps wanting to tell us that it's been killed. Okay? Are the two languages getting more similar? We have to go through this quickly. No, is the answer. I mean, not in any meaningful way. So this is another thing that people fear. Oh, pretty soon we're all going to talk this way. But our accents are actually growing apart in most ways. The things that we notice as new things in British accents, things like saying th instead of th, not that new anymore, or the places where the vowels are going in the mouth, they're all doing different things than they're doing in America. That's because you don't learn your language from the television, as much as people want to think you do. You learn your language from your parents and the kids who live in your neighborhood, and the slightly older ones who are slightly cooler than you, who you want to talk like. You don't learn it from Barney the Dinosaur or Sesame Street or anything like that. Grammar is, we've got some trends. There is some indication, you saw some, that British is getting things like the subjunctive through American influence, but through British influence, American is getting things like saying I would do. You would never have heard that in American English 30 years ago, but now you're hearing it. So some things are moving both ways too. The spelling differences are getting more entrenched. So when spell check came around, everybody thought, oh great, now we're all going to have to spell like Americans, right? Because Bill Gates says so. And my spell checker keeps changing things, and I don't like it. Well, it didn't change it so that everything's the same. So this chart is the IZE suffix in British newspapers from 1990 to 2005. And you can see that in 1990, people spelt realize with a Z in British newspapers around 80% of the time. This was never an American spelling. It was always a British spelling. But the thing is, Americans don't use the other spelling, don't use the ISE spelling. So the IZE spelling came to be perceived as an American spelling, and because the ISE was being underscored by spell checkers, people got angry. And they said, I'm not going to use that stupid American Z. I'm going to spell it this way. And that has been such a boon to that spelling that it has just disappeared. The ISE spelling has flourished, and the IZE spelling has disappeared in British English. I've been able to observe a lot of that happening in just the 23 years that I've lived here. Okay? So, vocabulary is the place where we expect language to change a lot, and we're not surprised when language goes between the two countries, where words go between the two countries. But this is a book from the year before I was born about which Americanisms would certainly be said universally by British people before the decade was out. And here we are 5 decades later, and British people do not talk about canned tomatoes. They talk about tinned tomatoes. They do go to movies sometimes, but they're not necessarily the same ones as they would call films. Right? Film still does very well. You tend to go up a lift rather than an elevator. And people are still complaining about meet up with and perceiving it as an Americanism 50 years later. So the things that people are fearing are happening to their languages don't often come to complete fruition. And this is a colleague of mine who teaches at the University of Lancaster, who did a computer-generated study or a computer-led study of the two countries' languages, where instead of saying, are British people saying sidewalk, he just asked the computer, which words are British people saying, which words are American words saying. So it was a less biased examination than we tend to get in the newspapers. And what he concluded was that the two nations are maintaining their differences in vocabulary. And you can just look at that in things like, even when you do borrow words from America, they become British. Think about how many menus you see these days that have fries or chips. And the reason why they have that is because fries doesn't mean the same as chips. It does not replace chips. When you see things being called cookies in Britain, those are some from Ben's Cookies. It used to be across the house, street from my house. Thank God they moved. But these are the things that Americans call cookies. They are not the things that British people would call cookies. And they're not even all the same things that British people would call biscuits. So cookies has come over, but it's found its own little niche. It came with some baked goods that weren't being sold here before, and now you've got a word for them. And again, I feel like I lost the slide. And if you think about things like recent technologies, like mobile phones, we're not saying cell phones here, are we? So even in the internet age, we are maintaining and inventing different words for the same thing, and those meanings are surviving. So, having said all that, in the end, neither of these Englishes is older. They have a common ancestor, but they've both been changing for 400 years. Neither is better. And anyway, it's not a contest. Both are wondrous, and I hope we can all enjoy them both. So, thanks very much.